I'm Em. I grew up in a town outside of Lexington, Kentucky, but I've been living in Indiana for the past few years. I'm in my early 30s now. This story happened in 2017 when I was like 24, still figuring out my life, working at a hardware store during the day, and Uber driving at night just to make rent. I didn't have much going for me at the time, just a 2004 Toyota Corolla, a tiny one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, and a circle of friends that had nothing better to do on weekends than drink cheap beer and drive around looking for haunted places to mess around in. My closest friend back then was Mark. He and I had known each other since high school, and while we weren't alike in every way, we shared that boredom that comes with being stuck in a small, dead-end town. Mark was working at a car wash at the time. He was the kind of guy who always had an energy drink in his hand. Monster, Red Bull, Bang, whatever was on sale at the gas station, and his trunk was always full of random junk. Old baseball bats, camping chairs, an extra pair of muddy sneakers, a plastic tote with cords and chargers, even a blanket with cigarette burns in it. He wasn't exactly responsible, but he was fun to hang around with, and we kept each other from going completely stir-crazy back then. One night in October, right before Halloween, I think it was Mark's idea to check out this old slaughterhouse that people around our county always said was haunted. Everyone had their own version of the story. Some said a farmer went crazy and killed his family there in the 1960s. Some said it was a mob hideout in the 70s where they butchered people instead of animals. Others just said it was cursed land, that the place had been abandoned for decades because too many people went missing in the woods around it. It was one of those places everyone talks about, but nobody really goes to, except teenagers who want to brag about how they survived the night out there. Mark had been there once years earlier with another group of friends, but they didn't go inside that time, just drove past it. He said it was about 25 minutes out of town, down an old county road that didn't even show up properly on Google Maps. That night, we'd been drinking Miller Lite at his place, playing Madden, when he brought it up. "Dude, you ever actually been inside that slaughterhouse by the creek?" I said no, and before I could come up with an excuse, he was already grabbing his keys. "Come on, man, let's do it tonight. Nobody's gonna be out there." It was around 10:30 p.m. when we left. I had on a gray hoodie and jeans, and I remember regretting not bringing a heavier jacket because the night was colder than it had been all week. Mark was wearing his usual basketball shorts and a faded University of Kentucky hoodie. He never cared about the weather. He drove us out there in his 2006 Ford Focus, which rattled every time it hit a bump. He had one headlight dimmer than the other, and the dash lights were half burned out, so it looked like he was driving with a Christmas tree that had some bulbs missing. We stopped at a Speedway on the way. Mark grabbed a can of Monster and a pack of Marlboro Reds. I bought a bottle of water and a Slim Jim because I was still slightly buzzed and figured I'd need the hydration. The cashier was some older lady with curly hair, and she looked at us like we were up to no good when she carded Mark for the cigarettes. I don't know why I still remember that. Maybe because, looking back, it felt like the last normal interaction we had that night before everything got weird. The county road we took had no streetlights, just long stretches of trees and farmland. I kept scrolling through phone trying to find a station that wouldn't kill the mood, but the signal was bad, so we settled on some classic rock that kept cutting in and out. We passed two deer on the side of the road, both staring at us with their eyes glowing in the headlights, and Mark made some dumb joke about how they were guardians of the slaughterhouse. Finally, we found the turnoff. It wasn't even marked with a proper sign, just a dirt path cutting through the tree line. We had to park halfway down because the road was too overgrown, so we got out and walked the rest of the way with our phone flashlights. The ground was muddy, and my sneakers were soaked within minutes. You could hear crickets and the occasional rustling in the bushes, but other than that, it was dead silent. When we finally saw the building, it didn't look as intimidating as I'd expected. It was a long, low structure with rusted sheet metal siding, half collapsed in the back. Most of the windows were shattered, and there was graffiti sprayed across the walls, Stuff like Satan was here and random initials. The front door was wide open, hanging off one hinge. We went inside, shining our lights around. The floor was littered with broken glass, beer cans, and old tools. The place smelled like mold and animal piss, mixed with the faint metallic smell of rust. There were hooks hanging from the ceiling, meat hooks, I guess, and giant drains in the concrete floor. Some of them still had dark stains around them that I really didn't want to think about. We walked through a few rooms, but honestly, nothing was happening. Just empty space, peeling paint, old machinery. At one point, Mark kicked an empty can and it clattered across the floor, echoing way louder than I expected. But then we turned a corner into what must have been one of the storage rooms, and that's when things got weird. There was a mannequin in the corner. A female mannequin, the kind you'd see in a clothing store, except this one was filthy, with smudges on its face and arms. Around it, piled on the floor, were women's clothes, dresses, tank tops, jeans, shoes. Some of them looked brand new, others were dirty and torn. I remember there was a pair of pink Converse sneakers with the laces still tied neatly, sitting right next to the mannequin's feet. Mark just whistled and said, "That's creepy as hell." I laughed a little, but it didn't feel funny. Something about it was just off. The way the mannequin was positioned, slightly leaning forward like it had been placed there carefully. The clothes didn't look like thrift store junk. They looked like they'd belonged to actual people, like someone had been collecting them. We didn't stick around in that room long. We made a couple jokes to cover how unsettled we were and walked back toward the front. That's when we both heard it, clear as day. A door shutting, that solid sound of a door closing firmly. We stayed, shining our flashlights around. The sound had come from deeper inside the building, but we couldn't tell exactly where. Mark said, "You heard that too, right?" I nodded. My heart was pounding in my ears. We stood there for like 30 seconds, trying to convince ourselves it was just the wind or some animal, but the place was too solid for that. Finally, Mark said, "Let's just get some air." We walked out the front and sat down near the tree line. There was a fallen log there, so we used it as a bench. Mark lit up a cigarette, and we sat in silence, both pretending we weren't freaked out. After a few minutes, Mark nudged me and pointed back at the building. There was a man in the window. I swear to God, there was someone standing there, half hidden behind the broken glass, just watching us. His face was pale, and the light from my phone reflected off what looked like glasses or maybe just his eyes. He didn't move, just stared. Mark said, "Holy shit." We both stood up. My first thought was that it was another explorer, some squatter, or even security. But the way he was standing there, it didn't feel right. Then he turned and disappeared from the window. We didn't wait to see what he was doing. We started walking back down the trail toward the car. At first, we tried to keep it casual, not running, just moving quickly. Mark kept looking over his shoulder every few seconds. And then, I saw him. The same man, only now he was on the trail behind us, like 50 feet back. He was wearing clothes that looked like a woman's, like a dress, or maybe just a sheet tied around him. It was hard to tell in the dark. His movements were strange, almost twitchy. And then he pulled something out. A knife. I could see the blade catch the light from my phone. Mark yelled, "Go!" and we both took off running. I don't think I've ever run that fast in my life. The trail was uneven, branches smacking against my arms, mud sucking at my shoes. Behind us, I could hear footsteps, fast, heavy, getting closer. We kept running until we reached the car. Mark fumbled with the keys, dropping them once before finally unlocking the door. We both jumped in, and he floored it out of there, gravel flying from under the tires. Neither of us said a word for the first 10 minutes of the drive back. We were both breathing hard, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. Finally, Mark said, "Did you see the knife?" I nodded. "Yeah, I saw it." We never went back to that place again. I can still picture that mannequin surrounded by women's clothes, the sound of that door shutting, and that man's pale face staring at us from the window. We barely escaped something worse that night. I'm going to tell you about something that happened to me a few years back when I was still living with my parents on our ranch out in northern Oklahoma. This would have been the summer of 2016. I was 19 years old at the time. I'd graduated high school the year before, was taking community college classes part-time, and helping my parents run the place. We had around 60 acres of pasture, 2 barns, and a herd of cattle that mostly my dad handled, but I helped out with feedings, fences, and little things like that. My mom worked in town at the school district office, and my dad was one of those people who never sat still, always out fixing things or talking about projects. To give you some background, my name is Katie, and our house sat about half a mile off the county road. Just a single-story ranch-style house, a gravel driveway, and a line of trees on the north side that ran along a small creek. The kind of place where the cicadas are so loud in summer you can't even hear yourself think, and where the nights feel darker than black. No streetlights, no neighbors in sight except for the Sanders family about a quarter-mile west. Their house was the only one you could faintly see if you stood on our porch and looked through the trees at night. That summer was hot. I remember we kept leaving bowls of water out for the barn cats, and the heat would dry them up by mid-afternoon. We'd had 3 weeks straight without rain. The grass was crunchy under your feet. And to be honest, that summer wasn't a good one for me personally. I had just gone through a breakup in May, and I was stuck in that weird limbo where you feel too old to be at home but don't really have a choice. I was spending most evenings watching Netflix in my room or walking down the gravel road just to clear my head. Now, on this particular night, my parents weren't home. My dad had driven down to Dallas for some cattle auction, and my mom went with him because she wanted to stop by IKEA, her obsession. They were staying overnight at a hotel, and I had the house to myself. That wasn't unusual, but I remember being kind of excited because I thought I'd get to binge-watch shows, eat leftover pizza, and sleep in. I think it was around 8:45 that night when I first noticed him. I was on the back porch with our dog, a black lab named Duke. The sun had just set, so the tree line was basically a silhouette against the darkening sky. And that's when I saw movement, someone walking just along the edge of the trees. I didn't even think twice about it. Out there, you'd sometimes see hunters, drifters, or even just neighbors cutting across land. People do weird things in the country, and you get used to it. But what stuck out was that the man didn't have a shirt on. He was barefoot too, or at least it looked like it. He was walking slow, almost like he was talking to himself, but I couldn't hear from where I was. He disappeared into the woods after a minute, and Duke started barking his head off. I hushed him, told him to come inside, and I remember thinking, just some drunk guy from down the road. About an hour later, I'd almost forgotten about it. I was lying on the couch with the TV on, Duke asleep on the rug. That's when there was a knock at the front door. But it wasn't a normal knock, like somebody hitting the door with the side of their fist. Maybe my parents had come back early, but when I walked toward the door, Duke started growling, a low, deep growl he rarely ever did. That's when I got this strong whiff, like a chemical smell. It was sharp, almost like gasoline mixed with ammonia. I knew that smell. It was that drug. If you've lived in Oklahoma long enough, you know that smell. I didn't open the door, I just yelled through it. "Can I help you?" The man's voice was muffled, but I could make out words. He slurred something like, "Let me in. It's hot. I need in." I shouted back, "You need to leave. This isn't your place." Duke was now at the door, his fur standing up, barking like crazy. I kept my hand on the knob but didn't unlock it. The man didn't leave. Instead, he started pacing around the porch. I could hear his bare feet on the wood planks. He muttered constantly to himself. Couldn't make out most of it, but I caught things like, "They're watching," and don't let 'em see." His voice would rise and fall like he was having an argument with someone who wasn't there. Then he moved off the porch. I tracked his footsteps as he circled the house. I turned off the TV and lights so he wouldn't see me moving around. My heart was pounding. I could hear him tapping at windows, scratching along the siding with his fingernails. Duke followed me from room to room, barking like he was ready to attack. I got my phone and called my mom. It rang twice before she picked up. She was laughing at something my dad said in the background, but as soon as I told her, her voice turned serious. She told me to call the sheriff immediately, stay inside, and lock all doors. And then it happened. The front door exploded inward. The frame cracked, The deadbolt ripped right out of the wood. I screamed and dropped the phone. Duke lunged forward, teeth bared, but the man didn't even seem fazed. He stood there in the doorway, his eyes wild, chest heaving, sweat glistening on his pale skin. The chemical smell was overwhelming, like it burned my nose. I didn't wait. I grabbed my phone and bolted out the back door, barefoot, sprinting across the yard. Duke was right behind me, growling and barking. I didn't even think to grab shoes, just ran full speed toward the Sanders house through the field. The ground was full of stickers and rocks cutting into my feet, but adrenaline carried me. I banged on their door like my life depended on it. Their teenage son, Kyle, opened it with a shocked look, and I just pushed past him, gasping, "Call the cops! There's a man in our house!" His mom ran in from the kitchen, grabbed the cordless phone, and immediately dialed 911. The deputies didn't take long, like 30 minutes. Out here, that's fast. The man was gone. They searched the house, the barns, and the tree line. What they did find was his shirt hanging from a low branch at the edge of the woods. And not far from it, stuck into the dirt, was a hunting knife. A big one, like 12 inches long. The sheriff questioned me for over an hour. They asked me if I'd seen him before, if I thought he was on drugs, if I could describe him. I told them what I could. Like mid-30s, thin, sunburned skin, dirty blonde hair, no shirt, khaki shorts. His eyes looked creepy, like he hadn't slept in days. They never caught him. The strangest part was, the sheriff said they'd had reports of a man wandering shirtless along county roads in the past week, knocking on random doors, but they'd never been able to pin him down. He was like a ghost. When my parents got back the next morning, my dad was furious. He spent half the day reinforcing the door with new locks and a steel plate, and he started keeping a shotgun propped by the door after that. I'm not really the type of guy who buys into ghost stories or supernatural stuff. I grew up in Kentucky, in a small town called Richmond, and for most of my life, things were pretty normal. I worked regular jobs, lived in regular apartments, and if I ever heard people talking about hauntings, I figured it was just something made up for fun. I never thought I'd end up telling one myself. To give some background, this happened in 2016. I was 28. At that time, I had just switched jobs from working at a warehouse in Lexington to doing overnight security at a trucking company. It wasn't the greatest pay, but I took the job because the warehouse had been killing my back and knees. Plus, I liked the idea of sitting in a booth at night and listening to music. I had just bought a 2008 Honda Accord a few months earlier, paid a little over $4,000 for it from a guy on Craigslist who had kept it in decent shape. It was my first car that wasn't on its last legs, so I took care of it. That year was just kind of weird in general. My sister had moved to Indianapolis, my roommate had gotten engaged and left, and I was spending a lot of time alone. I mostly worked, came home, played Xbox, and went on late-night drives when I couldn't sleep. I had a friend named Marcus who lived about 45 minutes south of me in Berea. Sometimes after work, I'd swing by his place since he was usually awake late too. We'd drink, play cards, or just sit outside smoking cigarettes, talking about random stuff. The night this happened, I had just gotten off a shift, and I was planning to head home, but Marcus had texted me earlier asking if I wanted to stop by. It was around 1:30 in the morning when I left work, and I figured why not. The drive down there, most people were asleep, the roads were empty, and I had some old Pearl Jam playing through my aux cord. I stopped at a Speedway on the way and grabbed a Monster and a bag of beef jerky. I always did that drive with snacks. The road between Richmond and Berea is mostly back roads, 2-lane highways, fields on both sides, barns, and gas stations. Marcus lived outside of town in this small duplex. The front yard had one of those little bird baths, and there was always an old Dodge Ram parked in the gravel driveway that never seemed to move. We ended up sitting on his back porch for a couple of hours, drinking Bud Light and talking about stuff, like how his landlord still hadn't fixed his AC and how I should think about moving south with him. By the time I was leaving, it was pushing 3:30. Now, here's where it all starts. On the way back, I missed my usual turn because I was messing with my phone. I didn't have GPS pulled up since I'd done the drive 100 times, but missing that turn threw me off. I kept driving straight, thinking I'd find another road that would cut me back toward the highway. After about 10 minutes, though, I realized I had no idea where I was. There weren't any houses, just miles of empty fields and the occasional fence line. I pulled over near a patch of trees to check my phone for directions. Service out there is spotty, so the map kept freezing. While I sat there waiting, I noticed the only light was from my dash and the glow of my phone. And then, in the rearview mirror, I saw something. I thought it was a shadow, like a branch swaying in the headlights. But when I leaned closer, I saw it was a man walking. He came from behind the car and moved toward the back. I remember the way my stomach dropped. He wasn't moving fast, just slowly making his way toward me. But what I noticed right away was his face. It wasn't a normal face. It looked completely black, like it had been burned. Not just dark skin, but charred. No detail, no features, just this warped, blackened surface where his face should have been. I didn't even breathe. The next second, I heard the sound of the passenger side door opening. My head whipped to the right, but when I looked, the seat was empty. The door hadn't even moved. It was locked. I sat there for a good 30 seconds, staring at the seat, gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles hurt. My heart was pounding. I finally told myself, "You're just tired. You've been up since yesterday morning. You're imagining stuff." That kind of thing. But deep down, I knew I hadn't imagined it. I got out of the car anyway, just to prove to myself nothing was there. The air outside was damp and smelled like rain, except there hadn't been any that night. Then, as I walked a few steps toward the back of the car, this other smell hit me. It was sharp, rotten, like burned rubber mixed with spoiled meat. I covered my nose with my shirt and shined my phone flashlight around. That's when I noticed the sign a little ways off the road. It was one of those old, leaning metal signs, the paint faded. When I walked closer, my stomach sank. It was the entrance to a cemetery. The place was small, like 20 or 30 headstones. Most of them crooked, some tipped over. Weeds everywhere. I hadn't even realized I'd stopped right in front of it. Suddenly, everything clicked. The smell, the figure, the feeling in my chest that I wasn't alone. I turned back fast, got into the car, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. The headlights swept across the field, and I saw it again. In the mirror. Same figure. Blackened face. Standing there behind the car. I slammed it into drive and sped off. Gravel kicked up behind me, and for a few seconds, I swear I could feel something pressing against the back of the car, like it was trying to hold me there. When I finally made it back to the main highway, I didn't even feel safe. I kept glancing at the mirror. I got home around 4:15, parked, and sat in the car for a while with the radio off, just trying to calm down. Eventually, I went inside, showered, and lay down. But sleep never really came. For the next week, I was sick. Not just a cold, I mean drained. My skin looked pale, my eyes had dark circles, and no matter how much I slept, I woke up feeling like I hadn't rested at all. My appetite was gone. Even my friends at work noticed, asking if I was okay. By the 5th day, I was coughing so bad I left work early. My boss, who normally didn't care about anyone's problems, told me I looked like death and should see a doctor. I never did. I just holed up in my apartment, drinking water and eating saltines, trying to wait it out. It was about a week later when I mentioned what had happened to a coworker named Daryl. He was an older guy, late 50s, had lived in that county his whole life. When I told him I thought I'd stop near a cemetery, he got spooked. "Was it off that county road?" he asked. I thought about it and said, "Yeah, that sounded right." Daryl shook his head. "Nobody goes near that place, even in the daytime. My cousin used to cut through there on his way to work until he saw something walking along the fence line one morning. Swore it didn't have a face. He quit that job the next day, just so he wouldn't have to drive by again." I laughed nervously, but he wasn't smiling. He told me people had been talking about that cemetery for decades. Strange smells, figures in the trees, cars breaking down when parked too close. Hearing that didn't make me feel better. It just confirmed everything. Years later, I think about it all the time. I've driven that way maybe twice since, both times in the daytime, and I made sure not to even slow down near that cemetery. Whatever I saw that night, it wasn't just in my head. I don't know if that thing followed me, or if I just left a piece of myself behind on that road. But I do know one thing. If you're ever driving alone at night and you see a little cemetery off a back road, don't stop.